I have traveled this road before with you. I read that it takes about 14 commercials before it's implanted into the consumer's mind that he or she may want to buy that product. And once it's done, then it's there. I mean, how many of us that grew up at another time can forget Ring Around the Collar? You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your tooth. You get it. So, I'm walking down this series of sermons because once again, I want to implant within your hearts and minds some pieces that I think are important. Last week we kicked it off with the whole vision thing, that you got to be looking for a vision to have a vision. And what I want to do is I want to insert into these sermons what one would call a self-differentiation place. That is, I want to try to make clear not only what some of the issues are, but where I am in terms of my vision of church in that. Now, it needs to be said, and I'm not picking on her because this probably goes through the brain of some of you. It just so happened that, Anna was looking for an opportunity to sleep in since she has a hard week ahead. And I bribed her. And she said that getting up and having an early breakfast at Denny's was worth suffering through another one of my boring sermons. To talk about polity can be to some boring, but it is a necessity to talk about it. I preached a sermon one time, and over again I tried to get the congregation engaged because I have that repeat. Congregationalism is a polity, not a theology. And they seem to relish saying that. And afterwards, 2 or 3 people approached me and says, well, we have a question about the sermon. And I says, yes. And they said, well, what is polity? I guess I didn't make the sermon very clear. Polity is how any given church governs itself. Because that becomes an important piece of the ministerial puzzle. How we govern ourselves, which is fed by what vision we share. Now I want to jump off of that to say that I love Luke. I love Luke's gospel because as one grad student once wrote a doctoral paper and entitled Luke, the Gospel to the Despised. Maybe that's why I love Luke. The underdog is always elevated in Luke throughout. I love Luke for another reason. Luke doesn't mind speaking truth, not just to those beyond the community, but speaking truth about how the people who make up church are, flaws and all. Go back to the Gospels, and you can see that. The disciples, Mark probably paints the disciples in some of the more negative ways, but Luke has more than he shares. Over and over again, the disciples failed to grasp who Jesus was, failed to grasp to whom Jesus had come, failed to grasp the width and the breadth, the height, the depth, all the directions one could imagine of Jesus' ministry and love for others. Peter gets written about in terms of his denial. Yes, some other gospel writers do that too. This guy, he was so impetuous, but his gifts and his flaws are clearly laid out for everybody to see. One of the followers of Jesus that we clearly know about, Judas, well, we get Judas's story. And so Luke comes into the sequel, the book of Acts, and right off the bat we have this passage, and I left out the part about Judas whose bowels were spilled out on the ground because I know you didn't want to hear that. Oh, I guess I just mentioned that. Flawed person, intensely flawed. So it's all laid out there. In Acts, we're going to find out 2 people who lied to the church, about what they got for their possessions, and it ended poorly from them. We're going to get later in Acts that Peter still doesn't get it, because God has to send a special vision to Peter, because Peter still wants to shy away from the Gentiles and refuses to go when called until that vision where God directly addresses Peter, says, "Don't you dare call unclean that which I view as clean." And then there was old Cornelius, who was the Gentile, who saw a need and had a vision to call Peter so Peter could perhaps have a learning experience. See, it's all out there, the flaws for all to see. That's how the church is. So here we have today a text, pre-Pentecost. Jesus has gone away. They come back. These people have been a defeated people. They have been torn asunder within their guts and within the community. Jesus shows up unexpectedly, and now they're gathering to pray about the what's next. So, what's the first thing on their agenda? Well, there's only 11. We need 12. Judas is gone. So they decide they're going to elect another apostle. Now, Paul would have a debate with them about, well, no, it's not just those people who were with Jesus from the beginning. There's room for other apostles. It just so happened Paul was nominating himself along the way, but that's another sermon about Paul's humility. So what do? They pick a couple of people. We don't know why they picked these two people. One that was called Justin, the other Matthias. So they kind of, wrote their names out on a rock or something, and they put them in a vessel, and so it was a 2-ball lottery. I'd like to have like $16 million at stake, and there's only 2 of us in the lottery. Wouldn't that be fun? As it turns out, Matthias' name gets selected to replace Judas. And I always say, they were so wise in doing this that they picked Matthias' name, and in Scripture we never hear about him again. He must have been a real powerhouse. I would say that it's an example of how not to manage ministry. The luck of the draw. The church began becoming more institutionalized through Acts. We've visited this before. Movements can't sustain themselves without structure. Structure always ends up choking the life out of the movement. It's hard to manage those tensions. And the church increasingly began to develop, and with the development came some not so good things. Hierarchy quickly began developing, top down. There were pockets and people and witnesses in those first 300 years who would push back on that. But always, hierarchy prevailed. It was in the system from beginning. Jesus had called the 12 and those who would follow to be not people of prominence, but people who would serve. Remember? Back to the Hebrew Scriptures. Abraham and Sarah were called to be the people by whom all the families of the earth would bless. Servanthood. Not top-down management, servanthood leadership. Sadly, when Constantine called a meeting of the church to work out all the what was heresy and not, things just continued to move in the wrong direction. Hierarchy reigned supreme. The church Catholic became more and more pronounced, and eventually there would be that great dichotomy that developed between so-called clergy, ordained people, and lowly lay people. Maybe that wasn't the intention. Maybe that wasn't. But when people have the kind of power in their hand to mismanage, inevitably they will misuse that power. So, a gap divides. It would be about, maybe 1,600 years. Now, in the 16th century, there was some of this brewing, but it was really the 17th century before those just irritating separatists began to speak out. And those in power, the monarchs, couldn't stand that speaking out because it meant that their power being blessed supposedly by the divine, was being challenged. So the separatists took off and they went to Holland, a peaceful place. Except their children were learning to speak a language that they didn't necessarily like. They didn't like some of the cultural bent, so they put together these wrecks called ships and set sail for the New World. On their way to Virginia. But these would-be rebels, in the later sense of rebels, were blown off course and ended up in New England. And what did they do when they got there? They became a dominant culture, using their power not always wisely or always well. Even some uppity women got run off because they were trying to raise their voice about who God was and what God's work was about. Out of that fermentation grew what we later would call congregationalism. A movement that said the church was about the people, all the people, and their ability to govern themselves. Every church owns its property. Every church calls its own pastor if it wishes. They kind of found a way to settle in. And now this is an exaggeration, so those of you who have had church history, Leonard, go easy on me. They kind of found a comfortable place in the table, somewhere squeezing between the Presbyterians and those wild-eyed Quakers. All right? And thus, congregationalism was born. The idea what? That everybody has a voice, everybody has a conscience, everybody should be honored. Now, I'm only addressing one corner of the UCC because congregationalism became the polity that kind of carried the day when the merger happened in the United Church of Christ. So I want to say this morning. There's two blessings I want to name, and then two curses with that. They're pretty direct. I don't need to elaborate or tell fancy stories. One of the blessings is this. In congregationalism, at its ideal, the gifts of all the members of the community are honored. And all the opinions, no matter how screwy some of them may be, because you've heard some of mine, all the opinions get weighed. And ideally, when that happens, the gifts are honored and the opinions are weighed evenly. Then hierarchy gets mitigated. That is top down. There's no bishop that's going to come in here and shake his or her finger at you and say, you can't do that. There's no bishop who's going to come in here and admonish you to play by the rules that somebody else established. This is our community working our way out and walking by the light that God has shown us as a community. That's beautiful. And this is not against anybody. I left the Baptist tour pretty congregational. And I stopped briefly with the Methodist. And I realized that bishops and I were not meant to be. It's something about my renegade ways. With all due respect to bishops, there's some wonderful bishops. I found blessing in congregationalism, people's ability as mature Christians to have a vision and seek it together. There's a power in that. Second thing is, the individuals, you and your journey, get treated with respect and meaning at the ideal. And when that happens, theological diversity and even pluralism comes into bloom. And there's a beauty and a power in that, because anyone who presumes that he or she has truth needs a time of reflection and repentance. Because the nature of being human means that you don't have all the truth all the time. That's the beauty. We gather together. What was it? That wonderful saying that came over across the ocean, to walk together in all God's ways. Wow. Here's the negatives. The curse, if you will. And that is that by virtue of being Congregationalist, we can grow to work on the assumption that because a majority of people can be led to vote some way, then we have theological truth and a true vision of what Jesus wants. Therein lies the rub. Well, if I can get 51%, I got truth. No, you don't. You have 51% of the vote. You see the danger? That's why we talk about covenant. Covenant. Secondly, it can lead to the formation of polarities within the church with no regard for covenant. People act like the United States government of today. I'm over here and you're over there, and, well, which takes the church nowhere. Right? That's what has to be managed. Polarities have to be managed. They can't be fixed. We can't all be on the same page all the time. That's how we are as human beings. Light breaks forth. We are at different places when we see that light. My vision as a pastor is that congregations, wherever they may be and whoever they are, and these days I'm journeying with this one, that we keep our hearts and spirits open, and we develop, as someone told me when I began the ministry, some old preacher. Those old preachers sometimes said very wise things, and sometimes they said very stupid things, but I remember this one, that if you're going to be a pastor, you've got to have the hide of a rhinoceros, all right, with the heart of a lamb. And sometimes that's what it takes living in the congregation. Our hides can get a little tough because we need that. As long as our hearts stay joined together in love. There is no one way to manage governance. In this wonderful thing called the United Church of Christ, there are so many different terms. I came in and began in an O'Kelly type church. O'Kelly people were a renegade Methodist. So everybody was an official board in Eastern Virginia and Eastern North Carolina. The governing body, it was the official board. When I eventually got to Pilgrim Church in Cincinnati, which really weren't Congregationalists by background, they were German evangelical, but they anglicized because of World War I intolerance. It was the consistory. Different terminology, similar governance. We call it all kinds of things. My vision is that we increasingly work to broaden the power, to expand the vision, that more and more people get on board and get heard, and whose gifts get utilized. That's my vision. In Dallas, we had a bunch of people who were ordained. You know what I did? When the bulletin got printed, the secretary had to get used to this. No matter who was participating that day in any form of leadership, all reverends got erased. I'm a little radical that way. Because I said, nobody in this place gets elevated above anybody else. Yes, I have been theologically trained. Yes, I have been set apart by the church to teach and to preach. I have certain gifts, but I'm not better than anybody else in this space. In 2 weeks, you'll be asked to vote. Now we're getting specific. 2 weeks. I'm getting ready to finish, by the way, so you can get the Denny's before everybody else, or God help you somewhere else. All right? So, in 2 weeks, you're going to receive a Constitution and bylaw. Well, you're going to receive it before then. You're going to receive it soon after the board meeting. Constitution and bylaws. Most of the language is just kind of cleaned up, more inclusive, except for one section, and it's on governance. And that is that I am proposing, and the board's been simmering with this for 2 years, a change in structure. Committee people will be elected. So it won't just be a board functioning with chair people who were never given a committee to start with. Why? Because we want those of you who are new to share the burden and experience the joy of sharing your vision and your gifts with the whole. We want to broaden that out. Even if I don't like what you decide, I want you to be engaged with the visioning. I want you to share your ministry, because it's not about my ministry, it's about your ministry. It's because you don't need top down. What you need is to flesh it out amongst yourselves with hides that might be a little tough, but hearts that are just pure gold. Because that's who you are. And you know that's who you are. So, that's a part of my vision. I love congregationalism. I love it. It has its many ups. It has a few downs. But it's the way we, the people of God, can work out who we are and whose we are, that others may know that God loves them to the very depths of their being. So I hate that I bored you with polity, but sometimes it's just a necessity to talk about how we gather and how we minister in the name of the living Christ. May God bless you to be open, that your gifts would be open. I'll close with this. I was in a meeting Friday, bored out of my mind over the new manual on ministry, that I'm on a committee on ministry now for the conference. I mean, did I tell you I was bored? And I got my back up because they kept talking about clergy. And I know that's the focus, about us being good boys and girls or not. But they kept talking about it in this kind of way that made me unsettled. Because I wanted to say, did anybody mention the fact that in each of the traditions, the main traditions of the United Church of Christ, that at one time or another, lay people really did get to serve sacraments? Did anybody mention the fact that lay people can preach too? Did anybody mention the fact that God hears lay people's prayers? Let's remember this. Let's struggle with this. Let's share together that we too would be open, as John Robinson once said, to that moral light that's breaking. And that we too would walk together in all God's ways. Today and always.